In this lesson, we're going to define what a variable is and how to create variable names. A variable is defined as a name for a memory location. Rather than reference a hexadecimal value where a piece of data is stored, we use a name that has some sort of meaning for the data that's stored there. We'll talk more about that in a moment. A variable always has a type associated with it. In other words, we're storing a piece of data in a variable, and that piece of data has a type. So the variable also has to have that type. And what that means is that when we create a variable of a certain type, we can only store data of that type in the variable. So in other words, if I create a string variable, then I can only store string data in that variable. Whereas if I create an int variable or integer variable, then I can only store an integer value in that variable. When I talk about data stored in a variable, I always call it the variable's value. And that's not a technical term, it's just a term I use. I just wanted you to see that so that when you hear me say that variable's value, I'm talking about the data that's stored in the variable. As for the naming rules, the first and most important rule is that a variable name must start with a letter. It cannot start with a number or any other character or symbol on the keyboard. It has to be a letter. After the initial letter, though, the variable name can contain other letters, numbers, and the underscore character. But notice I don't include symbols because symbols are not allowed in variable names. So you can't use the $ or the % or any other symbol like that. Some examples of some legal variable names include salary, name3, where the number is at the end, and first underscore name and last name. Some examples of bad variable names include 3name, where the number is at the first of the variable, and first space name, where there's a space between first and name. The compiler would get confused by that and think that first is the variable and wouldn't know what to do with another variable name or another identifier coming right after it, because that's not part of the rules of the language. So you cannot use spaces, and you cannot begin a variable name with anything other than a letter. There's no real limit to the length of a variable name, but a variable name that's too short isn't very meaningful. For example, if I use A to store my name, that doesn't mean very much. How would I know that A has a name stored in it, whereas if my variable was called name, then I know that a name is going to be there. And then variable names that are too long aren't practical in that you'll have to type the variable name several times in a program, and if it's more than 10, 15, 20 characters, you're going to get tired of typing it all the time. So you want a reasonably sized variable that has some meaning associated with the data that's stored there. And then finally, you should always start your variable names with a lowercase letter, because capitalizing the first letter is reserved for class names. And we'll get to that quite a bit later in the course, but for now, just understand that your variables should always begin with a lowercase letter. That's all the rules that we need to talk about for naming variables, so let's move on to the next lesson where we talk about how to declare a variable in a program.